Good afternoon. This is Truth Seeker here again, and it's another bright, beautiful spring day, a little greener than it was last time. Again, this is my lunch hour, and I'm running on batteries, so I'm going to have to make this quick. And I did make an attempt yesterday, and it went awfully long, and I'm going to try and keep it short. I'll get right to the crux of it. This is somewhat of a critique, in a way, of somebody I just learned about, who has made quite a sensation recently, and his name is Dr. Jordan Peterson, a Canadian psychologist who has just written a 12-step, or 12 rules. It's not a 12-step book. I should be more clear on that. It's not anything to do with a 12-step program, but 12 rules to live life by. And this has become a New York Times bestseller and wildly popular, and Dr. Jordan has done quite a bit of public speaking and debating. He debated Sam Harris. He debated Matt Dillahunty. And he's been interviewed by those that are differ with his points of view. And so last week I was listening to Matt Dillahunty debate Jordan Peterson. Now, I had no idea who Jordan Peterson was. And so I did a little looking up who he is and what he stands for, and I got somewhat of a general idea, and it wasn't a positive. It wasn't a positive response that I received from Dr. Peterson, and I'll tell you why. There are a couple of things that just bother me right off the bat about him. First, he holds himself out as a pretty self-important, and he is very evasive in his answering of questions. And I found a critique in Psychology Today by one of his peers, and they likened him to trying to critiquing Jordan Peterson to nailing Jello to a cloud. And I think that would be exactly the way I would describe it after hearing the first few minutes of the debate between Matt Dillahunty and Jordan Peterson. And there were a couple of things that really just struck me negatively right off the bat that got under my skin a little bit, and I talked with my counselor about it. He wasn't aware of this Jordan Peterson, and I played a little bit of the debate for him, and it had him scratching his head as much as I did, and basically what I did was Now, I found that I really didn't have to do this, I guess, but I copied down yesterday. I copied down the first few minutes of the dialogue. I found that on YouTube that there is a transcript portion, but the transcript was hard to read. I couldn't copy it well, and it wasn't entirely accurate. Although I did the best I could in copying it down, I may have been a little incomplete. It's possible I may have missed a word or two, but I think I got pretty much most of what the dialogue was. So, in the beginning of the debate, Matt Dillahunty comes out first. It's actually he sacrificed actually his time to do what he normally was going to do, which was a presentation on skepticism, what skepticism is, and he mixes that up with a little bit of magic, and to make his points on the idea of skepticism and what it's all about. And so he gave up this time to have a debate with Jordan Peterson, who agreed to come on. So he gave up what he normally would have done for the crowd. So it was really Dillahunty's time that he sacrificed to debate Jordan Peterson. Actually, the way Dillahunty explained it was more of a discussion. It wasn't intended to be so much of a debate. But in this discussion, they were going to broach topics that they possibly could disagree on. And so other than that, apparently Matt Dillahunty didn't know much about Jordan Peterson either, and hadn't read his book when he had this discussion with him on the platform, on the stage. And so Matt does the introductions, and they sit down at chairs. And he goes to opens up the discussion with Peterson with "How are you?" And Peterson responds, "Ready to go." Which, I thought about it a little bit. It seems innocuous enough, the way Peterson responded, but why didn't he say fine? That's the cordial response that normally would be expected to be given to somebody who asks you a personal question. How are you? And you say, well, I'm doing well. I'm doing fine. How are you? It's a introductory formality that people go through to set the stage of cordiality between them, and that's not what happened. Peterson's ready to jump in there. I'm ready to go. I'm fired up, and I thought it was a bit arrogant, and that it really demeaned Matt Dillahunty. Maybe Matt would disagree with me, but that was my observation. I would have felt demeaned if I asked a person how they were, and they responded, ready to go, knowing that they have plenty of time to discuss issues, So that was the first thing that caught my attention, and I thought was a bit on the rude side. one thing I noticed, and I um, looked up a number of videos where Peterson is being interviewed, where he is explaining concepts, his ideas, his beliefs, his outlook on life, and his philosophical point of view. I found that he usually or frequently prefaces the any statements that he will be making with the phrase or the statement, "Well, it's a complicated problem," and it happened more than once in more than one video, and so it seems to me that this Peterson believes that everything that he has to say is an important matter, an important issue, and that people don't really understand the issues, that people really don't comprehend the complexity of it as he does, that he recognizes the complexity. So right there off the bat, there's a condescension, an attitude there that frames what he is about to say with an air of demeaning condescension. And so that's how this discussion kind of started out. And so Matt asked the question. He got right into it with the response ready to go. So Matt Dillahunty went right into it, cut through the niceties. And Matt, and I'm quoting from the transcript that I came up with. I thought that it would be nice if we started with something quick and easy and simple, like God. In particular, I don't believe there is one, and I have no idea what your thoughts are on it. And Peterson replies immediately, "You mean on the fact that you don't believe there is one?" That, to me, that's being a wise ass right there. That was beyond humor. That wasn't humorous. He is certainly making fun of Matt Dillahunty's way of phrasing the question. Obviously, he knew what the question meant and what Dillahunty meant when he says, I don't believe in God, and I have no idea what your thoughts are on it. And he could have been more precise. He could have said on the topic of God, on the existence of God, and then he would have more specifically phrased the question in such a way that Peterson would have had to answer the question. But instead, he gets this, in my opinion, snide reaction. "You mean on the fact that you don't believe there is one?" Now, that's being a smart ass. Come on. He thinks he's cute. And that right there set me off. If I were Matt Dillahunty, I would have been pissed off. That's rude. That wasn't cordial. And he hadn't done anything. All he did was ask a question. And so Matt, kind of taken back a little bit, rephrased it and said, "No, I mean just about the subject in general, but I'd be happy to have your thoughts on what I think is valid." And then there was a long pause, and very long pause, and Peterson had this look of deep contemplation on his face and said, well, it's a complicated problem. What's a complicated problem? Whether or not he believes in a God? Well, maybe he does think it's complicated. But first off, he didn't answer the question. He says, no, I don't believe in God, and I think that there are a number of reasons why, and I think that the reasons can be complex. But he didn't answer it that way. He answers, well, it's a complicated problem. Well, in his opinion, it's a complicated problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that in everybody's opinion, it's a complicated problem, or that it's a problem at all. He doesn't explain why it's a problem. What does he mean by a problem? He doesn't explain that. And so Peterson goes on and says, I don't think that we take it with due seriousness. I specifically think that the celebrity atheist types, who I actually have a great deal of respect for, by the way, take it with due seriousness. So I don't think they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective, or a phenomenological perspective, or a literary perspective, or a metaphoric perspective. And I think from when I looked up the word phenomenological, it sounds to me that he's being somewhat redundant here when he says literary or metaphoric perspective. I think that's kind of inclusive in the definition of what phenomenological means. I could be wrong, but just what I gleaned from Wikipedia on the topic, because to me a phenomena is some sort of physical event. Me being a scientist, and I'm looking for reasons to explain that event or that phenomena. But phenomenological, from a philosophical point of view, is not such a simplistic term, and it's very open-ended. And in fact, it's if you look up the word phenomenological in Wikipedia, it gives you this explanation that really is very difficult to understand, because they absolutely say that to try and define what phenomenological means is, from a philosophical perspective, you can't really define it. Because if you try to pin it down with a definition, then it sort of negates itself, because phenomenological doesn't require evidence or a definitive explanation, to define exactly what they mean by it. So it to me, it was a little on the confusing side, what they meant by that word phenomenological. And I don't think I'm a stupid person, but my God, I don't think I'd be a very good philosopher either. So he says, I don't think that they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective. They, the celebrity atheist types, and he doesn't pinpoint who these are specifically, these celebrity atheist types. Is it Bill Maher? I would suspect that he's talking about Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and the other higher profile atheists who've made a strong presence as atheist activists, and so I assume that he's addressing those. But again, the majority of the principal, whom they call the Four Horsemen, two of them are renowned scientists. And then you have Stephen Hawking, who also was an atheist, probably one of the greatest scientists of our modern era since Einstein. And, so I don't know who he's really addressing when he says the celebrity atheist types, but that's who I presume he's addressing there. And he says who I actually have a great deal of respect for, but I don't think that they take it with due seriousness. So he doesn't respect them, really. If he doesn't believe that they're giving whatever the matter is that he's explaining here due seriousness, this question that he hasn't really directly answered, he's not really respecting those individuals by saying that they don't take it with due seriousness. So I don't think that they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective, a phenomenological perspective, or a literary perspective, or a metaphoric perspective. That'll do for starters. I became convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very functional cultures, Western cultures, say, are nested immovably in a metaphorical substrate, and that when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you are in the domain of religious phenomenology. And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion as a consequence of deep philosophical thought, I guess the conclusion that you've entered the realm of religious phenomenology because you've entered in, our culture, Western culture, is immovably nested in a metaphorical substrate, and by necessity that metaphorical substrate requires it to be in the realm of religious phenomenology. Again, phenomenology is the seeking of information, of knowledge, without supportive evidence, or without having supportive evidence. It's not necessary. That there are other means by which you can gain knowledge and understanding of nature, and these other means are literary, metaphorical, and he believes that by necessity it's a religious phenomenology or means, method by which you gain this understanding. And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion, the conclusion that it's the domain of religious phenomenology, as a consequence of deep philosophical thought and literary analysis, but if you know enough about brain function, you also come to the same conclusion. Now, I don't know that as a psychologist how much evolutionary biology that is really part of the curriculum to be a clinical psychologist, which that's what he is. He's a clinical psychologist that delved in the realm of research in human thought. His background was that he got his degrees at McGill, a couple of universities in Canada. McGill University is where he got his PhD, and he had a short stint teaching at Harvard University as an assistant professor, and then he went back to teaching at University of Toronto as a full professor. I understand that he's on sabbatical right now. But to go on, he says that I become convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very functional cultures are nested immovably in the metaphorical substrate, and that when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you are in the domain of religious phenomenology. And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion as a consequence of deep philosophical thought and literary analysis, but that if you know enough about brain function, you can also come to the same conclusion. I think you can come to the same conclusion as well if you look at the evolution of religious cognition from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist, and not from the position of an evolutionary biologist whose head is addled by the belief, these are pretty strong words, addled by the belief that most of human morality was established in the 500 years since the Enlightenment. So that's the start, I guess. Well, first off, I think that he's a little flippant, a little careless with his facts, because the Enlightenment wasn't 500 years ago. The Enlightenment began in the 18th century. And so from the period of probably the mid-1600s at the very earliest, with the Royal Society, you had Sir Edmund Halley, you had Rene Descartes, you had Sir Isaac Newton, who really began that period of time where the scientific method was really being developed, and then the Enlightenment period was really the age of Voltaire in the middle of the 18th century. And so that's not 500 years ago, so he's not being terribly precise, and I found that to be true in a couple of circumstances. So you do have to fact check him a little bit. The way he expressed all of this was very difficult, and I can understand that when you're on stage and you've got who knows how many people were in that audience. There could have been several hundred people in that audience. That it would be difficult to get that in one pass. So Matt sat back, and he's struggling with what Peterson had just said, and you can see this for yourself. The video is readily available online. Just look up YouTube, the Jordan Peterson Matt Dillahunty debate, and it's readily you can find it on YouTube. It's an hour and 43 minutes. Matt says, except, and you have to bear with me here because I'm from Texas. Now, I think he was just trying to be polite here, to say, you know, I really didn't capture what you just said. You know, please, for the sake of me and our listeners, could you simplify what you said and explain what you mean? Because to me and to Dillahunty, it was obvious that he didn't answer the question. The question was put forward was pretty straightforward. Was do you believe in God? And if you do, you know, why or why not? And that's not what happened. Peterson went on this evasive circular thing, so complicated that it really didn't have to be this complicated. He made it, deliberately made it that complicated. But it really boils down to saying that this is not a question that he believes anybody is taking really seriously except he himself, and that it is in the realm of philosophical consideration and in the philosophical realm of phenomenology, especially in the area of religious phenomenology. And that is, if you can sit down and think about it and from an entirely philosophical point of view, based on the collective experience of humankind as expressed in human literature and through human metaphor, you come to the conclusion that this is a question that is a matter of religious phenomenology. That's not answering the question Matt asked. So Matt's trying to get clarification here, and he's trying to be polite, and he says, you have to bear with me because I'm from Texas. And before he could ask him any further to clarify, Peterson butts in and says, that's okay. I'm from Alberta, you know. It's bigger than Texas, just as bad. What the hell? Where does this bad come in? What? They got an inferiority complex? Just as bad. I know some bad stuff. I mean, New Jersey is bad. New York is bad. You want to talk about badass? Who's talking about badass? That's really kind of childish. I don't know where that came from, but it came from his insecurity somewhere. So something there that just really bothered the hell out of me about the way he responded. And for one thing, Alberta is not bigger than Texas. I just had to look it up. I just had to. Texas is 268,000 square miles. Alberta is big, but it's 247,000 square miles. It's not as big. In fact, it is 21,000 square miles less than Texas. The state of Virginia is 42,000 square miles. So you're talking about half the area of the state of Virginia in size difference. And that's not trivial. That's a significant size difference. So I don't know what the hell he was trying to get at here. It wasn't funny, and it wasn't relevant to the question. And so Matt tries to bring it back to this question, and it says, so Matt says, so the curious thing for me, and and Matt made a point of an interview that Jordan Peterson had undergone with some British woman, a news person. I actually watched it. I can't remember her name now. It was a News 4 interview, and it was somewhat of a debate. She really went after Peterson, and she strawmanned him. So what you're saying is, and she must have strawmanned him a number of times, and Peterson had to keep reiterating, no, that's not what I said. You know, be careful. You have to be precise. Well, Peterson was doing this to Matt Dillahunty, and so this was not a very cordial way of responding. Now, maybe I got the wrong impression of Jordan Peterson, but I didn't get a very good impression of him on this or any of the other few interviews that I'd seen him participate in on YouTube. So Matt, being polite, says, so the curious thing for me, he didn't respond to the Alberta thing and being just as bad. So the curious thing for me is that all that applies to religious thought, religious tradition, the value to religious individuals, So the curious thing for me is that all of that applies. All that what he had just said applies to religious thought and religious tradition and the value to religious individuals. And I don't see that any of it relates to whether or not that there is a God or whether there is sufficient reason to believe there is a God, which is my sticking point. And I agree, and I was glad that Matt stuck with the point, with the issue, and they got into some other bizarre discussion about evidence of mystical experiences through psilocybin, and that Peterson was throwing out some statistics without any citing any studies or verification of the facts that he was throwing out, where he said that 80% of people who take psilocybin and have a mystical experience quit smoking. And Matt responded, well, there are plenty of examples where you can quit smoking without a mystical experience. And this is what Peterson was asserting, that you cannot quit smoking unless you have a mystical experience, and that this mystical experience can be induced pharmacologically through psilocybin, without really giving any consideration that maybe there are other factors about the psilocybin that make it such a successful, if it's true, a successful agent or pharmacological agent in allowing people to quit smoke. But it is true that you don't have to have a mystical, magical experience in order to quit smoking, and that was the assertion made by Jordan Peterson. I know it from my own personal experience that you don't. I quit smoking more than a year and a half ago. I had smoked for the better part of my life. I started when I was 13 years old as a rebellion to my parents and their extreme religiosity, I guess you call it, and I got hooked, and it wasn't a good thing. I was always a very active person. I even ran 10Ks, 13 half marathons. I ran 5Ks regularly, once a month, and I did quite well, actually. I had times in the 5-minute miles. I remember doing a 5K in under 18 minutes. I did a half marathon in an hour and 25 minutes. I did a 10-miler, the Army 10-miler down at the Pentagon, in 62 minutes and 30 seconds. And so I was always very active, but I just couldn't shake that monkey off my back. And then about a year and a half ago exactly, it was October 21, I had a heart attack. And we were down in Texas, and my wife and I were there to attend my nephew's wedding, and my wife got double pneumonia, and so I had to take care of her. We missed the wedding, and she was pretty sick, and we had to cancel the flight home. We couldn't leave. We had to extend our stay there a little bit. And her brother is an infectious disease doctor. Her sister-in-law is a pulmonary specialist, doctor, MD. And other family members are also. There were 4 doctors in the family at the wedding, and all of them, including the doctors at the regional medical center that were treating my wife, said that she should not fly because the pressure differential in the plane will force the infection lower into her lungs, especially a 3.5, 4 hour flight. So I decided I'd get a SUV, and that we'd drive home, and I'd just extend I had extra vacation time, and I thought we'd take a 3-day drive home from Texas, and we'd go through the South, and I hadn't been in Mississippi or that portion, of Alabama, so I wanted to see parts of the country I hadn't seen yet. And we only got as far as Houston, and we were in the hill country of Texas. So we had driven about 5 hours, 5.5 hours. We had just gotten through Houston, and the traffic was just horrendous. And I had chest pains, and I thought, gee, this is indigestion. And I stopped off at a pull-off and bought a bottle of Pepto-Bismol at the store in the gas station, and I drank the whole thing, and I didn't feel any better, and I didn't know what to do. My wife was sick in the car, and down there in Texas they have these emergency rooms down in Houston especially. They have these emergency rooms, full-blown, fully equipped emergency rooms, modern emergency rooms alongside the highway. I don't know if that's because they have a lot of shootings in Texas. I don't know what it is, but it's like no other place in the country that I've been to, and I've been all over the country. And I didn't recognize. I mean, I didn't know what was going on, but I really thought I need to get checked out. This indigestion is getting worse, and my chest pains were getting stronger. And luckily enough, there were one of these emergency rooms only about a mile away from when we got back onto the interstate, and so we pulled over. And I walked in, and I was clutching my chest as we walked into the emergency room, and thank goodness there was nobody there. And they knew immediately that there was something wrong with me by the way I looked, and they put me immediately into a room. They did a CAT scan on me, and they took blood work, and within minutes they had the answer. The enzyme showed that I was having a heart attack. So before you knew it, I was in an ambulance and off to Clear Lake Regional Medical Center. And my wife, she managed to somehow follow me. It seemed like 20 minutes through all of these back roads with all these turns. I don't know how she managed it. I really don't. But she stayed behind us, and she was really sick. And it happened so fast I don't even recall. But I was prepped for surgery, and immediately they put me into surgery, and they didn't wait, and they knocked me out, and then during the surgery they woke me up, and the doctor told me 3 times that I was lucky to be alive, and they installed 2 stents into my heart. And so, and also the surgical nurse who was there, she also said, "I've seen people die for less." And so I had 100% occlusion in one artery, and the other artery was 90%. And there was another. I had triple arteries that were blocked, and my heart almost stopped functioning. I was lucky, but I didn't have any mystical, magical experience. I didn't see any bright lights. I didn't have any baritone voices talking to me. My son convert, and I didn't have any visions of Jesus, and no statues of Mary were tearing drops of blood from their eyes, and no, it was not a magical experience. I just did not feel well, and I was having leakage in my groin because they had done a catheter, and I wasn't healing, and I looked like I had been hit by a Mack truck. I mean, the bruising was terrible. And I had to sit still, absolutely still for 24 hours without emotion. If I moved a little bit, the nurses came running in and told me to not move. And I've had back surgery, and I have a terrible back, and it was excruciating torture. I would never want to ever go through anything like that again. Thank goodness for the morphine, because it made it possible for me to sit still for the necessary period. They put a weight on me, a big sandbag, and luckily, after a day, I was able to move, and the leakage had stopped. But it's such a large artery, you can lose all your blood, hemorrhage very quickly, and become, critical very quickly with that if that artery doesn't heal. And I was in the hospital for a little over 4 days. And by that point, I didn't want a cigarette. And I had been smoking all these years. And it wasn't a magical experience. It was a life-threatening experience. But there are plenty of people who have heart attacks and can't give up smoking. I just was able to do it by force of will. And it wasn't easy. I wanted cigarettes pretty badly, and I had the cravings, and I had an addiction, a strong addiction to nicotine, because I had been smoking for so long. But I did what the doctor said, and I quit, and I quit on my own without any pharmacological help. I didn't take the Chantrix or anything else like that. I just went cold turkey. It was difficult, but I did it, and I haven't had a cigarette in over a year and a half now. But it wasn't a mystical, mystical experience. And so, from that, I think, Jordan's, Peterson's assertion that you can't quit smoking, and he was pretty strong about this, that you can't quit smoking without a mystical experience, is wrong and unsubstantiated. Now, I wanted to see, there was Psychology Today is a magazine that I enjoy quite a bit, and I wanted to see if there were any articles about Jordan Peterson in Psychology Today, and there were. I found 3 or 4 articles about him in Psychology Today, 2 that appeared to be more favorable towards him. They were earlier, and they were earlier articles when he first started getting notoriety, when he objected to a law that was coming out in Canada regarding transgender identification, how you had to address transgenders, and he objected to that very strongly as an infringement to his individual right to speak. and he is all for individualism and the rights of the individual over the collective. I don't believe that I think he believes in that there are people that are inherently superior to others. That he uses some sort of lobster analogy, that there's this hierarchical, not in nature, that there's this hierarchical order, and that this is something that's been going on for billions of years, and that there's a tremendous difference between men and women, and that we can't have equality between men and women. But there's a big difference between men and women being different and thinking differently, and even having a different responses and hormonal differences within humans that cause us to respond to stimuli differently. It doesn't mean that women are inferior to men, or that they should be paid less for doing the same job. And he tries to justify this, that women inherently are less likely to be confrontational than men, and that's why men are more successful in the business world, because it takes this confrontational attitude to move ahead. And maybe he's looking at it all wrong, and maybe that's an artifact of a civilization that really wasn't functioning well. I didn't like that idea that our Western culture is the ideal model necessarily, and that we're a highly well-functioning society. Yes, in some ways we are, in other ways we aren't, and the idea that we could come up with the Constitution of the United States, which is a secular document, and it's not a Christians always say that it's a Christian document. It's not. It is not. It was a response to the Age of Enlightenment, because of the more than 1,000-year period in which there was a church-state theocracy that governed Europe, and there were tremendous human rights abuses and privileges only for the elite, and the masses were in ignorance and left illiterate and poor. 95% of the human population in Western Europe was completely illiterate and poor, and practically serfdom was practically slavery, a different form of slavery, and it just wasn't a system that worked. And so the founding fathers of the Constitution made it a secular document that ensured the separation of church from state. And there was no preferential church. There was no preferential religion. When the Constitution guarantees the freedom of religion, the freedom to worship, it doesn't prefer certain religions over any other. You have the right to believe what you want to believe from a religious perspective, and to worship peacefully in this country. That's why so many different denominations came to the United States, so that they could exercise this privilege that we have under the Constitution. But looking in psychology today, I did find a sort of a rebut in a way that I thought was very well written by Paul Thagard, PhD, who is a Canadian philosopher and cognitive scientist, and a contemporary, a peer of Jordan Peterson. And I was reading through his The article is called it's not Peterson's Murky Maps of Meaning. It's something about flimsy. Oh, here, Jordan Peterson's Flimsy Philosophy of Life. And there were a number of things here that I agreed with 100%. And I'm going to put the link in on this, and I'm not going to be talking too much longer. I don't want to take this video too long. You certainly already got my impression of Jordan Peterson. But morality. He critiques Peterson. He says, Peterson's rules for life are intended to tell people what they ought to do, not just what people actually do. And they concern morality, which raises an important philosophical question of the basis of ethics. Peterson's answer looks to religion, in particular Christianity, as shown in these quotes. Even older and deeper, and these are Peterson's words, I'll let you know when they're not. Even older and deeper than ethics, however, is religion. Religion concerns itself not with mere right and wrong, but with good and evil themselves, with the archetypes of right and wrong. Religion concerns itself with the domain of value, ultimate value. That is not the scientific domain. It's not the territory of empirical description, although with the smoking and the psilocybin, he was trying to argue that it was measurable, that there were empirical ways, empirical proof of mystical experiences. So he flip-flops around with his answers depending on the circumstance. The Bible is Peterson's words, better for worse, the foundation document of Western civilization. Now that again is not true. That the Western civilization historically was a theocratic Christian church-state collaboration, but after the American Revolution and the U.S. Constitution, the concepts of separation of church and state and secularism began to spread in both in Europe and in the United States, put it to practice in its constitution. It spread through the French Revolution into Europe. The French spread it, and Napoleon's conquests. They brought these ideas of liberty, equality, and so on, fraternity to the rest of Europe, and it resulted in the revolutions of 1848, where the rest of Europe, the monarchies and the traditional church-state system collapsed during the 19th century, and the last remnants of that kind of collapsed right around the turn of the century. The Russian Revolution and World War I brought down the last few monarchies, except for the British, and they're basically just figureheads, and they have been so since the 19th century, late 19th century. So anyway, going back to Peterson, it says the Bible has been thrown up out of the deep by the collective human imagination. Well, I don't know what collective human imagination he's talking about, except maybe a Western perspective, because you have China and you have India, and you had much of the rest of the world, which had much more of the population, encompassed much more of the population that did not contribute to Western concepts of good and evil. And so it's not a collective collaboration representative of all humanity, which is itself a product of unimaginable forces operating over unfathomable spans of time. Its careful, respectful study can reveal things to us about what we believe and how we do and should act that can be discovered in almost no other manner. This connection to morality with religion justifies his frequent use. Now, this is the author of this article. This connection with morality and religion justifies Peterson's frequent use of the Bible stories such as Adam and Eve in his discussions of how to act. Now, the story of Adam and Eve I gave in my last video, and I showed the amorality of that. And you can go into the Bible and talk about, you know, the prejudice against women and the advocate of slavery in the New Testament, women not allowing to teach in the early Christian church. You can talk about the amoral stories in the Old Testament of Lot sleeping with his two daughters, of Judah sleeping with his brother's wife and spilling his seed on the ground, and the stories about God, killing thousands of people, and even his favored people he was going to put to death. So there are a lot of stories there that are not moral. The bears, Elisha with the 42 children that made fun of him as Baldy, calling him Baldy, and he called two she-bears out of the forest, and they attacked and mauled the 42 children, killed them all. And you know, that where are the moral lessons in that? You know, I mean, come on. I mean, the Bible is not a moral document when you really stop and you analyze it. So this idea that Christianity should be the basis, the model for society is bad, in my opinion. Thagard goes on. He says you don't require religion to be a good person, which I also advocate. And he goes on to these other rules that in the 12 rules that Peterson elicits or has asserted are the rules to live by. And the 12 rules for life, and there are other criticisms about being and his misunderstanding of the existential point of view, philosophical point of view of what it means to be, and there are a number of things here that I agreed with. I just don't have the time to read them, except this last thing. Peterson's elusive style makes critiquing him, and I think I said this earlier, Peterson's elusive style makes critiquing him like trying to nail jelly to a cloud. And I agree 100%. I agree 100%. And he says here, but I have tried to indicate alternatives to his assumptions about morality, individualism, reality, and the meaning of life. If you go for Christian mythology, narrow-minded individualism, obscure metaphysics, and existentialist angst, then Jordan Peterson is the philosopher for you. And again, a little example, rereading without any interruption what he had to say. It's a complicated problem, and I don't think that we take it with due seriousness. I specifically don't think that the celebrity atheist types, who I actually have a great deal of respect for, by the way, take it with due seriousness. So I don't think that they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective, or a phenomenological perspective, or a literary perspective, or a metaphoric perspective. That'll do for starters. I become convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very functional cultures, Western cultures say, are nested immovably in a metaphorical substrate, and then when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you are in the domain of religious phenomenology. And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion as a consequence of deep philosophical thought and literary analysis, but that if you know enough about brain function, you also come to the same conclusion. I think you come to the same conclusion as well if you look at the evolution of religious cognition from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist and not from the position of an evolutionary biologist whose head is addled by the belief that most of morality was established in the 500 years since the Enlightenment. And you know what? I think that a lot of our morality was established in the last 50 years. When you stop and you take into consideration Jim Crow, separate but equal, and there's an awful lot of that. The conservatives really go for basically, okay, for an example, this business with the strong opposition, conservative opposition to the Boy Scouts changing their name and opening up admission for girls to join the Scouts. And there's strong opposition to that, and I don't have any particular feelings for it, but it's one of those things that conservatives really are opposed to, and I think the only reason that they can be opposed to it is that they want to preserve a concept of lifestyle that existed in the 50s, and that was hardly ideal. I remember separate but equal. I remember my father grew up in Florida, and we used to go down to visit family all the time back in the 50s and 60s, and I can remember seeing at gas stations white and colored bathrooms and white and colored drinking fountains, and that was 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And this civil rights, the idea of civil rights and equal opportunity and all of that has arisen within the last 50 years, since the 1960s and 70s, and the conservatives really oppose it, but society is transforming, and we can't hang on to these old ideas any longer. And it's a shame that most people are terrified of change. So anyway, those are my points of view, and I guess you can understand what my beliefs are. I apologize if you don't like them. I'm sorry. They're just the way I feel. I'm the father of 2 daughters and a wife, and I think we probably live more of a conservative lifestyle than most, and I do believe in strong family values, but I also don't want to see my daughters addled because they're women. I'd like them to have equal opportunity in this world. And so I see nothing wrong with girls tossing balls and making fires and learning certain outdoor skills, and the idea of the Girl Scouts was created in that era of the boys. The boys had Boy Scouts and the girls had Girl Scouts, and they did cookies and they did girly things, and girls don't want to do girly things. My wife grew up a tomboy. She wanted to play with the boys. She wanted to toss a football, She wanted to climb the trees and skin her knee, and she was very much a tomboy, and that's what I love about her. She's she's fantastic outdoors person. And but anyway, you know what that smacks of? It's just a very obscure, separate but equal. Oh, you know, they've got the Girl Scouts, leave them in the Girl Scouts, and the Boy Scouts should be left alone. And you know, I don't see what the problem is, but to me it just seems like another form of separate but equal. And the world is slipping away from the conservatives, and they're terrified. They're terrified, and when people are terrified, they react. And I think that. But eventually they'll find out that the world that we're evolving to is not such a bad world. It's not such a wrong thing. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing to be scared about. And I think that's what this Jordan Peterson is tapping into this fear and feeding it and making the situation worse instead of making this situation better. And certainly I don't adhere to the idea that we should base our society upon Christian principles. I think we should revere the secular aspect and the secular nature of our Constitution. I think it's a precious document that we should, by all means, respect, and respect for the origin of it and the basis behind it. So anyway, this is Truth Seeker here saying so long, and thanks for listening.